work in the following way. Vision is a field, and history is a flow within that field. Like nature and myth work together, nature is a field and myth is a flow within that field. Nature has an integral, a mysterious integral, because the integral of nature is zero. Nevertheless, it is a field, not a 0 point. Let's be realistic. A 0 point vanishes. Comprende? Into what does it vanish? A 0 field. So the encompassingness of 0 is that it participates in an integral cycle. How does it participate? It participates by conferring what is called ordinality. There's cardinality, which is the counting, which is the sequencing, 1, 2, 3, 4, A, B, C, D. What you can count on, that's the way in which cardinality works. Ordinality is the stepping up by powers, beginning not with 1, but beginnings with 10. The 1 and the 0. So the 0 appears in the counting due to the ordinality being able to interface and enmesh with the cardinality, so that the 0 gives the powers to cardinality. You can count by tens, powers of 10. The most interesting is to count by powers of 2 by squares. And when you're dealing with space, squares geometrically, mathematically, are extremely useful, and one of the great advances in world civilization, not culture, civilization. Culture deals with truth, with dharma. Civilization appreciates high dharma. In the way in which the high dharma participates, the squares apply to the geometry of spatiality. The whole development of an appreciation, the triumph of a method of determining least squares, very famous in mathematical history. But one can also count by, that is indexed by 3s, by cubes. Not only squares, but cubes. And cubes very often refer to the cubicality, not just the plane of space, like plane geometry, but the cube, and the cube has a deeper quality then, that it is all 3 dimensions of space. So that you can have ordinality by squares and ordinality by cubes. And they relate to each other in such a way that the progression of squares is able to ratio with the progression of cubes. And however large the squares and the cubes, if they're at the same horizon of ordinality, they will always make a ratio that resolves to 1. It's called Bode's Law, B-O-D-E. Bode's Law, in the way in which planets arrange themselves in the solar system, so that the squares of the space that the plane of the orbit describes and the cubes of the fact that the orbits are not circles but ellipses, that the time has to speed up on the curve of the ellipse and has to slow down on the elongation of the ellipse. And the first person to ever master the mathematics of putting the squares of space and the cubes of cubic space together to make ratios of the real was Kepler. He was a contemporary of Shakespeare. Shakespeare was born in 1564, Kepler in 1571. He lived longer than Will. Shakespeare died at 52, 1616. Kepler lived on to 1634. It was Kepler's meticulous analysis of Tycho Brahe's observations of the movements of Mars against the starry expanse for years and years and years at his big sit-in-lay-in telescope observation place on the island of Uraniborg off the coast of Denmark, not all that far by boat from Copenhagen. The squares and the cubes, that space as a plane and cubic space then as a way of having a trigonometry come into play. Not just a geometry, but a trigonometry, because one is now dealing with a time element. And because there's always an integral that is the dharma, the truth of the way in which you're computing, the cardinality and the ordinality now become comprehensive. And when they are comprehensive, one understands that the dynamic of time comes into play with the ratio of the real, where the space and the cubic space, the plane and the cube, come together as an expressive unity that one then has a way of establishing. If one could have the dynamic of time woven into that, so that the plane geometric and the cubic trigonometric now give us a calculus, that now one has a third highest power. One has a way of calculating the infinitely small and the infinitely large together, all within the theoretical, the contemplative pairing, putting a parenthesis around 0, 1. That in between 0 and 1, there is an infinite increase, differential equations, and from 1 to 0, there's an infinite decrease, integral calculations, and one can now understand to any degree of specificity whatsoever, due to Newton and Leibniz, one can understand that one is able to express in a grand Principia Mathematica that this is now a way to understand the universe in any degree of specificity one wants to attain. All you need to do is not just ask a question, but to phrase what it is that you're curious about investigating in that language. And the investigation carried out in that language is able to give you not just the result, not just the answer, but to give you the further resolution of this in terms of an integral, so that one understands that what you ask, here is what you get. But what you asked was incomplete, so what you got is also incomplete, which means then that you have to widen your theoria. You have to widen, and it's not that consciousness gains, it's that your access enlarges. Consciousness is an infinite field. And an artist can tell, not just immediately, but before immediate. Because an artist deals not only with the infinite field of differential consciousness, but the integral field of zero nature, so that what occurs to them doesn't occur instantly in time, but spontaneously. Out of before there was a time. The ancient Egyptians called that eternity. An artist's familiar realm is to refresh instantly and then spontaneously. Instantly, in this is the moment, aha, and spontaneously, I knew this before the aha was expressible, happened. And so the coursing in eternity is free. Not just true freedom, but high dharma freedom. When human organizations get to a certain complexity of commandeering, of the cardinalities, the ordinalities, the planes and the cubes, and factoring in the dynamics, that complexity comes to an immensity which one feels that if you can only ask the question. And that's one of the great poetic lines in T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, preluded by the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock. The evening lies like a patient etherized on the table. I shall wear my socks rolled down. If only I could ask the question, which is never askable in those terms and leads directly to the wasteland. At the close of the 19th century, one of the most powerful integral complexities in the world at that time, seemingly, was the Theosophical Society, formed around Madame Blavatsky, a Russian. She could roll her own cigarettes, she could go adventuring on her own, she could understand completely all kinds of complexities, and wrote a huge 3-volume series called, the volumes are called The Secret Doctrine of All Time. And complemented, because that was like the cube, complemented that with the square, 2 volumes, a pair, called Isis Unveiled. And between Isis Unveiled Pair and Secret Doctrine Cubed, now we have the path. Now we have the one. And all we need is that one messianic figure to commence the teaching of this. About a generation after Madame passed away, the Theosophical Society had gained in focus and in complexity and made in 1911 the Order of the Star. We will have a star Messiah who will come and will deliver us. And so we will prepare. We will prepare all over the world for the coming of this Messiah, of the Order of the Star to present, because this is the way it should be. And they found by a very sophisticated divination quality of investigation in India, a young, interesting, more than interesting, incredible young boy. And he was very close to his younger brother. That boy's name was Krishnamurti. And so they prepared him by education for years and years. Education overseen by a man named Leadbeater, C.W. Leadbeater, to be the Messiah for the Order of the Star. And when he came of full age and maturity in 1929, he had centers in Los Angeles, in Hollywood. He had centers in the Netherlands at Camp Omen, O-M-M-E-N, centers in India, in Madras state, near the southern edge of Madras, now a huge metropolis, where the Adyar River came in at Adyar, and many other places in the world. And on August 2nd, 1929, before thousands of people in the Netherlands at Camp Omen, he dissolved the Order of the Star. He said, there are no more messiahs. When Krishnamurti at 91 passed away in that distant suburb of Los Angeles called Ojai, a bulletin was put out by the Krishnamurti Foundation. Their bulletin had been the magazine that began in the 1920s to be the vehicle by which the world would be able to keep track of the Theosophical Society, the Order of the Star, Krishnamurti, and the special issue was put out, and a photograph of Krishnamurti was placed before the first page describing the event and the events, and then they reprinted his presentation in 1929 of dissolving the Order of the Star and why there were no more messiahs. There were no more Orders of the Star. There were no more theosophical societies. He died in 1986. The secretary, the last secretary to Madame Blavatsky, was George Robert Stowe Mead, M-E-A-D, G.R.S. Mead. And G.R.S. Mead was a genius, not like Krishnamurti in the sense of being able to spontaneously speak high dharma for not only as long as one cared to speak and listen, but for years into decades. And he taught for almost 70 years worldwide in just his own way of sitting on a wooden kitchen chair and just speaking, not the stage setting that this speaker employs, because this teacher is the art of learning and not the learnless spontaneity of realization. We have to learn first. Then we don't have to do much except to be able to understand that it's important to keep the history fresh and alive in the arts and the sciences. Because along with the arts, like the arts mitigate the interface between vision and history, science does the same between it's a way in which there is the complementarity that science brings into play with history. Art brings vision and history together. Science brings history and complementarity together. The complementarity comes because one has to save the natural cycle. There was a great high dharma critical writer named Owen Barfield, and one of his first wonderful little books is called Saving the Appearances. It's important to save the appearances. Yes, they are appearances, but the appearance of the appearances is a wonderful present that one learns to open again and again. And the opening again and again is a way of transforming any calibration, however complex or simple, into a recalibration where you save the appearance and can still appreciate and use the calibration, but now the recalibrations are infinite. But one has to do this in a particular releasing way. That is, one has to do a doubling, and then one has to do a tripling, and then one has to let it be free. So there is such a thing that is pithy, and that is the triads, the cubes, lead to a use of the squares, of the geometry, which leads to not just the development of the path, which is a path integral, but leads to the field, which is a field of zero and infinity. There is a path integral, and its appearances are magnificent. But they do not just lead indefinitely. They lead to whatever it is that you are going to from wherever it was that you were beginning from. And to go before the beginning and beyond the end, one enters into the eternal. And to not know that means that you make a false image and turn it into a phony idea of eternity. And that's how devolution happens, and the beauty of the world becomes demonic eventually. We live in 2014 where the world is not just crazy, certifiably, but does not know it is ignorant, which is worse than being crazy. G.R.S. Mead, being the secretary of Madame Blavatsky when she passed away, had a chance to be the titular head of the Theosophical Society. He's the one that took over. Madame Blavatsky's magazine was called Lucifer. One would think, yes, well, Lucifer is demonic, right? The devil. And she thought, no. This Lucifer is the light giver, the light bringer. My magazine, Lucifer, is the light bringer. Mead understood that this was a limitation of the imagery, of the symbol, and so he changed Lucifer to have a different title, and the magazine became Quest. And under Mead, the magazine Quest became one of the real great vehicles for a transform that was happening in the world from 1892, when Madame passed away, into the beginnings of the 20th century. And by 1911, when the Order of the Star was being formed, Mead already had seen the limitations of the Theosophical Society so limited that he left society. He dissolved himself out of it, and a couple of hundred people who were like the cream of those conscious in the society went with him. And they formed a kind of equality of that would be recognizable in high Dharma of noble friends, a phrase from Zarathustra of about 4,000 years ago. Pursuant to this, G.R.S. Mead began to put out book after book, volume after volume of very high Dharma concerns. One of the ways in which he had weaned himself away from the Theosophical Society's limitations, phony grandness, and not all of it seems phony at once, or is phony at all, but that in aggregate, it aggregates only into a monumentality that, as E.E. Cummings in one of his poems said, it comes out like a ribbon and lies flat on the brush. One of his great magnum opuses is a 3-volume translation of Thrice Greatest Hermes. Volume 2, in the middle of the 3, are the classic Hermetica, and then a volume that leads us to them, and then a 3rd volume that leads us with them even further. And this was all published in London by Watkins, a very famous publisher still in business, in 1906. By that time, G.R.S. Mead had understood enough to understand that the Hermetica were the creme de la creme of a whole Hellenistic era that was not reducible to what academics had called, they were just imitators, they were syncretists, they were piecing together patchwork by patchwork. Even so, one can say there's a great art to making beautiful heirloom quilts out of seeming patchwork. There's all sorts of ways of understanding that the interfacing in what is called the Hellenistic era is an interfacing that happens just before a carrier wave transforming the time form of civilization, and the next century or two that carried the beyond of the carrier wave. but was being sabotaged all the time, every time, by those that would undercut it. Instead of being an undertone, it's like an undercurrent. And that if you try to swim ashore with an undertow, you will drown, because the undertone will convert your swimming towards the shore into swimming parallel to the shore in place. And so the enemy of civilization are not the enemies. It's those who themselves constitute the undertow. To not recognize even the possibility that when a time form is over, it's over. And a new time form has spontaneously been born. The whole quality of that in ancient Egypt, 3,000 years before the Hermetica, written in Alexandria about in the 90s AD, the pair of figures that were tunable 3,000 years before were Isis and Osiris. Here's a little study recently done, and a man named Tom Hare, H-A-R-E, remembering Osiris. It's not only the remembering of Osiris, but it's literally putting the members of Osiris back together. Remembering him, and then remembering him. And it's interesting because the gerund, remembering, is not memory. Memory is a function area of the mind, much like the imagination. They go together, in fact. The memory and the imagination are buddies. More than that, they are kind of like found siblings that belong together, because the imagination, when its function of imaging becomes not just imaging, but becomes imagining, the transcendental imagining goes creative. It's free. It's free to play. It's free to play in the eternal, which is where the springs of art come into play. And so art is creative imagining and remembering together. But in order to do an exchange, a reciprocality which is universal, as the imagination gifts its imagining creatively now in the freedom of vision, vision takes remembering and gifts in the place of the imagining that has been given, gifts back the memory. And so remembering becomes the memory in mind, and the imagination in mind becomes creative imagining and vision. So that vision and the mind, one an integral and one a differential, have this paired double tie. They have a tie between the imagination and creative imagining, and remembering and the memory. So that it isn't that the whole cycle, the integral of nature is cut off, it's that it's transformed. It's given a thumb, an identity, not an identification by that thumbprint, but given the activity of transformation as a dimension. And once one understands that, it isn't just remembering Osiris, but that Osiris now can be embodied. Here's a study embodying Osiris, the secrets of alchemical transformation, with the Eye of Horus. Because Isis becomes fertile and pregnant by the remembered Osiris. Every part of 14 parts of Osiris that were cut up by his demonic nemesis Set, the red dog, jealous, desert, demonic, cut him up into 14 pieces, and 13 pieces were found by Isis. She went around and gathered up to remember him, but she could not find the penis, because the penis had not remained. It had been swallowed by a blind fish in the Nile. And that fish was unable to see, but navigated by a kind of a sonar reverberation. And so the disappearance of the phallus of Osiris was replenished by Isis in a kind of a supranatural way, and by that supranatural phallus she became pregnant, and their son was Horus. Their son was the eye of high Dharma, able to see the truth that we are not limited in birthing, but we are capable of rebirthing. More next week.